You see, the decreed will of God is like, for instance, let me give you some examples. You're single, you're dating someone. Am I supposed to marry this woman? I mean, now the moral will of God is if you're a Christian and she's not a Christian, you're in sin by dating her. Because the moral will of God is that Christians shouldn't marry non-Christians. And so therefore, that means you shouldn't date non-Christians, okay? So the moral will of God is don't be unequally yoked. Christians marry Christians. So, but now, if you're a Christian, loves Jesus, she's a Christian, loves Jesus, that don't mean you need to get married, right? So is it God's will? You don't know. You pray about it. Now, you get inclinations, and the Spirit speaks to you, and all these things, and I think my mic's messing up. But y'all hear me better now? So you get inclinations, and you hear all these things, and so is the moral will of God. You know that, but you don't always know the decreed will of God. You just don't always know it. I mean, should I take this job? Man, that's it. You don't know. You pray about it. You search for answers. You ask God's help. But do I take this job? That's the decreed will of God. You don't know until, right? I mean, should I buy the senior pastor a new car? Yes, that's the decreed will of God. You should do that. But you have these things you don't always know. That's why you pray. And Paul's point is this. Paul's point is when you pray, even though you pray against the will of God sometimes, the Spirit fixes that. And what do I mean praying against the will of God? Well, I mean, all of you, I guarantee you, if you were a Christian as a teenager and you loved the Lord, here's what you did. If you were a Christian as a teenager, and then in your 20s, maybe in college, man, you had a boyfriend, you had a girlfriend, and God, I pray this is the one. I pray this is the one. It probably turned out that it wasn't the one for one or two people, right? Before you got the one. And when that happened, you pray, God, help her to say yes, help him to say yes, or help. Then what happened is when that didn't happen, when you prayed for him to ask you to marry him and he broke up with you, you might have even been angry at God, like, God, God didn't answer my prayer. Well, no, God did answer your prayer. He just didn't answer it according to your will. Now you go back, and I'm giving you this because this ought to be, man, if you prayed that, I promise you, you can go back now. If that was 20 years ago, you can go back now and think about that prayer that you prayed for that dude to marry you or that gal to marry you, and it didn't happen, and it broke your heart because you thought God didn't answer you, and you look back to now and say, God, thank you that she didn't marry me, right? Because you were praying, and God's will was not for you to marry that person, right? And you didn't marry that person. God's will was for you not to marry that person. What broke your heart then, through those experiences, you begin to understand, listen, when I'm praying, and it's not according to God's will, the Holy Spirit takes that prayer and fixes that prayer. Man, that happens whether it's a job. Do you want me to take this job? Man, you pray, and you should pray for it, right? Paul didn't always pray according to God's will. The biblical saints reveal this to us, the heroes. Paul, we know that he had a thorn in his flesh. I don't know what it was. You don't either. There's speculation about what it was. But Paul had a thorn in his flesh. He prayed at least 3 times that we know of for God to remove that thorn. Now, I'm assuming he probably prayed more for God to remove that thorn, but we have recorded 3 times that he prayed for God to remove that thorn. God said, my grace is sufficient for you. He didn't remove it. Paul was praying for it to be removed. It wasn't God's will to remove it. So but Paul, if you had a thorn in your flesh, if you have one, you're praying, and that's good. That's a righteous prayer, right? I mean, Moses prayed for God to let him into the promised land. Didn't happen, right? Elijah, we already talked about Elijah. He prayed for God to let him die because he thought he was the only one following him. Didn't happen. All of these guys prayed against the decreed will of God. They prayed against God's will, but the Holy Spirit fixed their prayer, right?